Hey everyone, and welcome to the 30 Days of Courage. I'm Ashley Easter. I'm your host for tonight. Thank you so much for joining the 30 Days of Courage. That is what we're doing inside of this Facebook group for the month of October. And if you are just showing up for the first time, maybe you're new to the Facebook group, maybe you're tuning in because you heard about this talk and you're coming specifically for this, great. I'm so glad you are here. And also, we have a lot of amazing things happening in October. And so before I get into the talk I'm going to do, which is called Cults, Hidden in Plain Sight, How to Spot Them and How to Break Free, we are going to go over a couple of details about what's happening during the 30 Days of Courage. So for one, we have speakers every Friday night, and tonight it's me. So you get to chat with me. After this talk that I give, there's going to be a live Q&A. So at any time you can drop questions in the comments, and I am going to be able to look over those at the end, scroll back through, make sure I didn't miss anything. But other things going on, we have self-care challenges that are happening during the weeks. And this week for our self-care challenge that many of you participated in was all about moving your body in ways that felt good, whether that's stretching, taking a walk, playing with your dog, whatever it is. And each week, at the end of the week, we give away a prize for those who participated. We pick one winner randomly from the group. Thank you for doing that as well. You've encouraged me this week to get moving my body more than I often do. You've encouraged each other. And just for participating this week, you'll be able to go into the challenge next week. And if you do all 4 challenges, even if you get stuck behind and you have to catch up, as long as you use that special hashtag in there, you'll be eligible to win the grand prize in the drawing on the 30th day of October. All right, so let's get into the talk. I'm going to be talking about cults hidden in plain sight, how to spot them, and how to break free. We're going to be going over some of the characteristics of cult leaders. We are going to be talking about some of the signs that somebody's in a cult. We're going to be talking about the different phases of being in a cult, how to connect with other people who may be in cultic environments, and how to help them gain a renewed sense of self. And then we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So that's going to be a lot of details and information, but I want to talk to you first about why this is such an important topic to me. We're going to get into the details of cults in general, and I think there's going to be a lot for you to learn. But before I do that, I need to tell you my story and why I'm so passionate about discussing cults, because truly they can be hidden in plain sight. All right, so I grew up in a couple of different movements that were kind of smashed all together into one movement. And to really give you an idea of my experience growing up, I'm going to have to share with you some different definitions of terms, because the thing about cults is they like to do something called loading the language. And they like to create their own definition for different words, and sometimes they even make up their own words. And if I don't explain what some of these words mean, you'll be like, what is she even talking about? So let me describe a little bit about my upbringing, about my growing up experience, and the different types of movements I was a part of. So the first movement I was a part of was the Independent Fundamentalist Baptist Church. Now, there are about 20 different types of Baptist denominations. They are not all the same. There's some very progressive Baptist denominations. There are so many different Baptist denominations, really. So I'm not saying all Baptists here, but the Independent Fundamentalist Baptist Church, also sometimes called IBF, is a very strict religious group. And people have said on its own that that church denomination is like a cult. So even aside from the other things that I'm going to share, it was a high control environment. And both of my grandfathers were pastors in this denomination. One was in the north, one was in the south. I grew up in the south in Lynchburg, Virginia. I went to the church where that grandfather was, and I went to church from, I want to say, the time I was about 2 weeks old. And that was just because I guess my parents needed some recovery after the birth. So I was there from the time I was an infant, and I was in church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. I was often there for different in the week activities. So whether it was something when I was kind of in the grade school time, or anytime the doors were open, I was there. And I'm the pastor's granddaughter, so there's even more pressure to kind of show up. And in this church movement, for our church, there was, I believe it was the bylaws. There was some church documents that I have someplace, but they actually had these in the rules that you could not dance, you could not drink, and it was really frowned upon for you to go to the movie theater even. There was strict roles for men and women. Only men could be pastors. Only men could have power and control. And there was really a lot of weird, quirky things. When we had communion, some people call it the Eucharist. It was a very scary time because it was like, if you don't take this worthily, some people are sick or even die because of this. Just very, very intense stuff. And I'm not going to get into too much about that movement just because we would be here all day. And if you want to hear more about that, there is a great podcast called Preacher Boys Podcast. One of our board members does that podcast, and they go really in depth in that whole IFB movement. But that wasn't the only movement I was a part of, or my family was a part of. So in addition to that, I was also homeschooled. And homeschooling can be a good choice. There's a lot of different reasons people homeschool. I know during this, medical crisis that the world has been going through, a lot of people have had to homeschool their children, do Zoom classes. Olympic athletes sometimes homeschool their kids. I know the queer community, sometimes those children will need to be pulled out of school and homeschooled just for their protection and safety. A lot of legitimate reasons to homeschool. But the thing about the homeschooling movement is it really started out of this religious, political kind of propaganda movement. And so there was a lot of that in there. And people have pulled away from that and secularized the homeschooling movement. But there's a lot of groups within the homeschooling movement that are very, very controlling and honestly pretty extremist and frightening. And so one of the groups that we were a part of was called the patriarchy movement. And yes, it is exactly what it sounds like. It's about adherence to the patriarchy. So men are to have power and control over women in the home, church, and in society. Men are to be the main breadwinners. Women are often encouraged to get married young, to say yes to sex, to have lots of babies, and really to submit to their husband in everything. It was very controlling, very domineering. And if you happen to have a more traditional styled family and that's your choice, hey, no judgment here. You do what works for you. But there's a difference between having particular preferences and God says you must do this. And if you don't, something bad could happen. And that was more the idea behind it. So you've got the IFB, you've got the homeschooling movement. Inside the homeschooling movement, you've got the patriarchy movement. And it's kind of like those Russian nesting dolls where they all like stack into each other, but they're all like one horrible doll in this case. So patriarchy movement. Then inside of that was another smaller movement called the Quiverful movement. And you might be familiar with the Quiverful movement based on some of the pop culture references I'm about to give. So there was a show on TLC that was called 19 Kids and Counting. It was about the Duggars. You may have seen some of the big abuse scandals that happened there. There was another show called Welcome to Plathville. I believe that's still on TV. And then something about the Bates family. I don't remember exactly what their show was called, but those are kind of the closest pop culture examples I have. So if you've heard the term Quiverful movement, and you're like, what is that? Well, that's kind of one of those made up words that I have to tell you what exactly it means. So they take this verse out of the book of Psalms, they strip it out of its context, and they take it super literally. And the verse goes like this: Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. And it talks about men having lots of children, and children are like arrows in a mighty man's quiver. Blessed are the man whose quiver is full of them. And it's this focus that they have taken this verse again out of context, and they've said, for you to be a blessed man, you should have a quiver full of children. And those children are going to be like arrows. And those arrows are then going to be shot out into society to take over different sectors. And I remember sitting through a talk when I was a teenager with other families that thought very similarly to mine. And this talk was called the 200-year plan. Have you heard the 200-year plan? No? Lucky you. I'm about to tell you what it is, but I'm glad you haven't heard about it before this because it's really not a great plan. So the 200-year plan is this. You have 10 kids, those 10 kids have 10 kids, and those 10 kids have 10 kids, and on and on and on for 200 years. Your friends are doing this, your family are doing this, and after 200 years, we all have this astronomical amount of descendants that we will shoot out into the world like arrows to sink into different sectors of society like the home, church, school, media, government, music industry, all the different places, and we will dominate the world through overpopulation with this patriarchal message. That is a lot for a teenager to take in. And then when you hear that your place in the movement is to be one of those ones having those many babies and homeschooling them and then shooting them out like arrows, like it's a lot of pressure. It's not just pressure for the women either. There's a lot of pressure for the men and boys in the movements as well. But that wasn't the last movement we were part of. So IFB, homeschooling movement, patriarchy movement, Quiverful movement, the very last doll in that Russian nesting doll set, the stay-at-home daughter movement. That was what I was a part of. And in fact, I was a stay-at-home daughter spokesperson. I had a blog called Stay at Home Daughter where I wrote to about 3,500 women about adherence to the patriarchy and why I thought it was good to be this submissive woman who didn't have a mind of her own and couldn't make her own decisions without a male spiritual leader telling her what to do. And being a stay-at-home daughter, women in this movement focus on a couple things. They focus on submitting to their father. They focus on learning homemaking skills and really preparing to have that family and perpetuate that 200-year plan. And they kind of came up with this idea because it was like, well, if they're going to have adult married women submitting to their husbands and children are supposed to submit to their father and their parents, like what do we do with these adult unmarried women? We can't have them running around not submitting to anyone. That would be a travesty. So let's call them stay-at-home daughters, and they'll submit to their father even as adults until they're given away in marriage to another man that they will then submit to for the rest of their life. So that's what I grew up in. And those movements I identify as being a cult survivor. I experienced a lot of different abuses there, and I'm not going to go into those details because we didn't have a big trigger warning at the beginning. But one thing I will say was I was in a very toxic relationship, and that was not the only abuse I experienced, but it was one of those situations where we were tracking down the days to getting married, we were engaged, and when I called it off, that was really, really difficult for me. Not because I really missed the guy, but because of all the PTSD that came up for me. It was a lot of darkness and depression and anxiety and panic and nightmares and all the things that you expect with PTSD. And that lasted for about a year. And sometime I'll tell you the story about how deep and dark that got. But suffice to say, there was a point in time where my intuition kicked in. And my intuition spoke to me and told me that it's going to be okay. Something big, something good is about to happen. And a couple of months or weeks later, a woman who briefly visited our church and was like, this is not for me. Good for her. She caught on a lot faster. She worked at a coffee shop. She invited me to come visit her at the coffee shop. And when I came there was a man she introduced me to. He was still churchy and like Christian and all that. But he asked the typical questions that you ask somebody. And he was like, "So what do you do?" And I was like, "I'm a stay-at-home daughter." And he's like, "What?" And I'm like, "Yes, I teach people about biblical femininity." And he's like, "What the what?" And I was like, "Yes, that is from the scriptures." And he was like, "I don't think so." And he kind of asked me a lot of questions, and it honestly started to get kind of annoying to me. I was like, "Oh my God, this guy, he's trying to lead me astray. He's trying to lead me out with these feminist ways." And it's just, I don't know about this. Um, and I kind of tried to separate myself from the situation, but he found me on Facebook and he kept asking me these questions. And I realized I really wasn't sure what the answers were to these questions. He had some good questions. But one thing I did know is that homeschoolers are notoriously good debaters. That is a stereotype that is 100% true. And so I was like, to get this guy off my back and to answer some of these questions, I'm going to have a debate with him. And the best way to have a debate is to do your research. So I knew, of course, all of my arguments. I've been writing blogs about this. Heck, I'm a pastor's granddaughter, okay? I know all the stuff. I've read all the theology books supporting this point of view. But to be a good debater, you have to research the other person's point of view and know it so well that you know where their weak points are, so you can just kick the legs out from underneath them and you can win the argument. So that was my plan. I'm like, okay, got to prepare for this. So I start researching. And those questions that he had asked me started kind of getting bigger in my mind. And I knew how we on our side would answer the question, but there were just some things that didn't sit right. So I started looking into sources that would affirm equality for women in that perspective. And I came into it 100% with the plan to just blow his legs out from underneath him, to win the debate, to just be like, okay, this is why you're wrong. This is why women should submit to men. And, you need to stop teaching this heresy, basically. Well, that debate never actually had to happen because the research convinced me. I was looking to pick it apart, but what I saw shocked me. I started realizing, you know what? I think this might be a cult that I'm in. And all this equality for women stuff, that makes a lot more sense than the things I've been taught. And you know what? I think they just taught this stuff to me to try to control me and to try to make decisions for my life. And I started being able to find it even from like a conservative Christian perspective. I was able to kind of find how verses had been twisted. Then on the other hand, I was able to find it from a secular perspective, a sociology perspective, and just really being able to see how, you know what? I think equality for women makes things safer for women. And it's also really good for men when we look at the statistics and the good things that can happen when there's equality between men and women. And so I was really taken aback. I did not expect to come away with that kind of understanding. And it scared me. Like, it scared me so badly because I realized that had been the foundation of my whole life. And if I was going to start believing in equality for women, I couldn't be a stay-at-home daughter anymore. I probably couldn't attend that church anymore. I need to start taking responsibility for my own life and my own relationships and not having my dad tell me what I could or could not do as an adult woman. And if that was wrong about my belief system, what else had I been lied to about? What else was misleading me? And that really brought me down this path to deconstructing all of these beliefs and continuing to ask questions. And I started changing so much ideologically, and not surprising, family was not really happy about that. A lot of church people were not happy about that. But one of the best things that I started to do was to become really rebellious. And when I tell you I'm rebellious, it was so rebellious. I started listening to Taylor Swift, going to movie theaters to see Son of God on TV, and dating and swing dancing. I mean, so rebellious. I just like went off the rails with that. I remember telling my friends when we were at the movie theater, again, this is a movie about Jesus. I was like, nobody take a picture and post it on Facebook. Nobody can find out that I'm here. And so it was just one of those things where I started taking some freedom back for myself. And I was ideologically freeing myself, but there was still that feeling trapped physically. There wasn't really a good way for me to live on my own and take care of myself because of the choices that had been made. And so I was really just kind of there, and I contemplated and kind of gave an ultimatum with my family a bit about like, you guys got to start treating me differently or I'm going to leave and I'm going to live in my crappy car, which wasn't ideal. But like I said, I also started dating, and that ended up being an interesting experience. I have a lot of funny dating stories. You'll have to ask me about that sometime too, because whew, going from this very, extremist conservative group to traditional dating, it was wild out there, I'm telling you. But my friend who had invited me to the coffee shop, it turned out that her mom was a good matchmaker, and she introduced me to my now husband, Will Easter, and he was so amazing. My intuition was like, yes. His intuition was like, yes. Really, that was how I was physically rescued. Gives new meaning to getaway car at the wedding. But yeah, that was kind of my physical escape. And we did all kinds of rebellious things. Like we had a kiss before we got married, which we weren't allowed to do. And he put his arm around me and read me the Easter story from the Bible one day, and I got in so much trouble about that at one point. So it was a really interesting experience, and he told me, I thought it was kind of funny. He was like, do you want to date me? Do you want to be in a relationship? And I was like, yeah, I do, but I've got to tell you, I've got a lot of baggage, and I just kind of want to let you know on the front end. And he's like, oh, no, it'll be fine. I'm so much older than you. I'm sure I've got a lot more baggage. We're 14 years apart. And he's like, it'll be fine. And then we get married, and like all the trauma starts hitting even more. And I'm like, I told you, I try to give you a way out, but but he stuck by me and never shamed me or blamed me. He's given me a safe space and believes in equality for women. And that was really where I was able to kind of find myself, realize what I like and dislike, and really discover who I am outside of the cult-like environment. And then the rest is history. Eventually Courage 365 was created, and all the other types of work that I'm doing. And so freedom on the other side of the cult has been amazing. Highly recommend not being a cult, but being in a cult. It's it wasn't much fun back then. And one thing that I realized from escaping this community was that people on the outside didn't necessarily know that it was a cult. Some people did, but a lot of people would have looked at us and not recognized it as a cult because they didn't know really what a cult was. In our minds, we sometimes think about these gated compounds, and we think about people who are trapped and tied in a basement. And let me tell you, that stuff absolutely does happen, but more often than not, cults are hidden in plain sight. And they're people that they're people that you run into. Cults can happen and pop up in any type of environment, and knowing the signs and symptoms of a cult can really help you protect yourself, to evaluate whether you're in a safe community now, and to help other people who are in there. Because if I hadn't had the help of other people giving me a different perspective on life, I might still be there today. And who knows who I would have married and what my life would have been like. And I might have had a jillion kids by now, and just, really not listening to what was right for me, but listening only to what I've been told. So I see all your beautiful comments coming in. I thank you so much for that. It really makes me just feel happy to know that you're here, that you're listening. And now I'd like to kind of shift into more the practical part of the talk, the part you've been waiting for. So let's talk about first what a cult is. I'm going to read a couple of things for you. And the way that I got information about what a cult is by studying a lot of material online. One organization I really like is called Freedom of Mind. Stephen Hassan is a really powerful person in this space. I believe he was in the Moonies cult, and he's done so much research and helped people escape from cults. And anyway, a lot of the information I'm about to share, I learned from the research provided there, but it's, of course, in other places as well. So, a definition of a cult. There are so many different meanings people give to the word cult, and one of the most popular ones I've seen, particularly in Christian circles, is anything that doesn't believe in the creeds or the Apostles' Creed or the Knights' Creed or any of those things. Anything that doesn't believe in that is a cult. That's not what I'm talking about here. I am talking about high control communities that demoralize you and put you in a space where you are really not your own anymore, where you are becoming attached to this community and your personality almost becomes swallowed up by this group. And the International Cultic Studies Association, it defines a cult like this. It says an ideological organization held together by charismatic relationships, demanding high levels of commitment. Cults are at risk of becoming exploitive, manipulative, and abusive to members, and many professional researchers use the term cult to refer to a continuum of manipulation and abusiveness. So I think that last part is really important, that continuum piece. So you do, on one extreme of cults, have people locked in basements, in compounds, and the things that you hear about with people drinking Kool-Aid. That is a cult. 100% absolutely. But cults actually exist on a spectrum of control. And there are quote unquote lighter forms of cults that you will more typically see. Now, these criminal enterprises that are in the extremist realm, you hear about FBI raids happening, those are important to watch out for 100%. But there are so many things in between that and a healthy group that can pull you into something destructive without you even realizing it, because you have this caricature in your mind of what it means to be in a cult. So I've also done my fair bit of research on cults, and a definition that I like to use based on the things that I've read is a cult seems to be a high control group with a central ideology or leader characterized by manipulation, exploitation of its members, and cults exist on a scale of overt to subtly dangerous and anywhere in between. So that is my definition of a cult. I'll read it one more time. A cult seems to be a high control group with a central ideology or leader characterized by manipulation, exploitation of its members. Cults exist on a scale from overt to subtly dangerous and anywhere in between. So there's this spectrum that cults can be on. It's a high control group, but notice it doesn't say the number of people in the group. So cults can have thousands and thousands of members in them, or it could be a cult of just a handful of people. In fact, sometimes families can even become cults depending on the dynamics in the relationships there. And we'll talk a little bit in a minute about some different places cults can pop up. But the other thing that I really appreciate about Stephen Hassan's work with Freedom of Mind is that he's created something called the BITE model, the BITE model. And each of the letters in the word BITE stand for a different type of control. And you can find this list by just Googling the BITE control. And I'm going to show you here. These lists have so much under each category that I'm not going to read all of them, but I do want to share with you some of these things. And as I do, I want you to think to yourself, have I experienced this in a group? Do I know of a group like this, that somebody else is experiencing this? And what parts of these feel familiar to me? Now, a cult doesn't necessarily have to have every single one of the describing factors here, but it will have a good number of these. And this is a great way to distinguish what a cult is. So the BITE model. B stands for behavior control. So this is where cults try to control what your behaviors are as a member. And just a few examples from the list would be dictating where, how, and with whom the member associates or isolates from. Another one would be when, how, and with whom a member has sex. Controlling cult members' types of clothing or hairstyles. It could include financial exploitation, manipulation, or financial dependence. Another big one is discouraging individualism and encouraging groupthink. So remember what I said before. Really, you kind of get almost absorbed into this group ideology, and you have a hard time thinking, what is my own thoughts? What is the group's thoughts? What are things that I believe for myself separate from what I'm being told to believe? Another part of the behavior control can also be instilling dependence and obedience. So when you're in a group where you start to feel like, I can't live without them, I would be lost without this group. And even if there's some challenges, I really need them to survive. And I need to obey what they say to keep in favor with the people in control. The next part of the BITE model is the I, which stands for information control. A couple different ways that can look is minimizing or discouraging access to non-cultic sources of information. So a lot of times what you'll see is they will start creating their own media. They'll create their own TV. They will create their own articles, and they'll say, we've got our own studies, our own information, our own this, that, or the other. And they will shame you and really say that it's a horrible, terrible thing if you start looking at information outside of what they give you, anything that could be contrary to what they're teaching you. So that could be, don't look on the internet, or don't look in certain places on the internet. It could be controlling if, when, and what TV, radio, books, news articles, magazines, or media that you consume. It would be controlling any critical information, anything that's critical of the cult, really telling you not to do that. And also a big part of the information control is telling you not to talk to former members who have left, especially those who have left and are not in good standing with the group. They do not want you to hear what the real story is behind them leaving. Another part of the information control can be compartmentalizing information into outsider versus insider doctrines. So they might tell one thing or show one face or present themselves in one way on the outside, but on the inside, where the members are when you're alone, they could act, think, say things completely differently. If you had met my family at the grocery store, if you had seen us eating dinner out, you've been like, oh my gosh, what a sweet, nice family. They've got a big family. Their kids are so well behaved. Oh, they never fight with each other. It's all cool. Soon as you step back into the car, soon as you get back home, there's a lot of things happening behind the scenes that people don't know. And that can happen for bigger groups as well. So one more thing I want to mention with the information control section is unethical use of confession. So in religious settings, they might actually call it confession. I think in Scientology, they do the e-meters where people are supposed to tell about their flaws. It's actually really common in groups to have to share your perceived sins or crimes against the group. And sometimes you're even pressured to say things that aren't really wrong just so you can have something to confess. And of course, with the information control, they're also going to want to disrupt and dissolve your boundaries and not give you access to information that you actually could make other choices. All right. So on to T in the BITE control. This is thought control. So it requires members to internalize the group's doctrine as truth, adopting the group's map of reality. So they may have a completely different idea of what reality is. I know for myself, I really thought the world was out to get us, and that's why we needed to dominate the culture with overpopulation with our message, because we were like saving the world from catastrophic disaster and going to hell or something like that. They often organize people into us versus them, insiders versus outsiders. They teach thought stopping techniques. So, a thought stopping technique is anything that causes you to stop having critical thoughts or questions. And some of the things people can use is chanting, meditating, praying, speaking in tongues, singing, or humming. Now, on their own, those things are not bad, but if you use those things, anytime you start to think a thought that is wrong in the group's eyes to kind of redirect your mind, that's when things become a problem. Other things they'll do with the thought control is labeling any alternate belief system as illegitimate, evil, or not useful. The last letter in the bite model, letter E, is emotional control. So this is about manipulation and only allowing you to feel a narrow range of feelings. You can only feel happy, or you can only keep sweet and obey. You can only express, devotion, feeling sad or angry or upset or questioning. Those emotions are not okay. They love to instill fear. Fear of thinking independently. Oh, when they went off to college, they got these liberal ideas and they started thinking different ways, and now they're gone the way of the world. They don't want you to feel like the outside world is safe, so they'll instill fear there. They'll often call different groups of people enemies. They might talk about losing your salvation and what could happen in the afterlife. And there could be threats, or even just you could see what happens, people getting shunned after the cult, after they leave the cult. Sometimes there can be public confession that you have to do. And there's never a legitimate reason to leave a cult in the cult's mind. Like, whatever you do, you should be staying within the cult. There's never a reason for you to be like, you know what, this isn't for me anymore. And so that'll be another big piece of that emotional control. So that's the bite model. All right, so now let's talk about who is susceptible to cults. I did kind of a question and answer type thing, or at least a question thing, on Facebook the other day to see what you all were interested in me talking about. And one of the top things that I noticed people asking was who's susceptible to a cult and about different types of groups of people that they'd heard might be susceptible. So here's the thing. All of us can be susceptible to a cult. Every single person could fall for a cult. You see, there is this idea that people who are in cults are in them because they're either born into them or that they are weak-minded and easily deceived. That's not the case. Cults target people who have specific needs and are specifically vulnerable. And often those things overlap and happen at critical points in our life, during transitional points in our life. And every one of us has been in a transitional time in our life. So a transitional time could be leaving your hometown and going to college. It could be leaving a different group and looking for something else. It could be getting married and having a hard time. It could be recently getting divorced. It could be having a death of a child. There are so many transitions that we have in our life. And when we are in transition, and especially when we're in transition and we're looking for community, that is when we are vulnerable most to cults. That is the type of people that cults like to target. So, a professor of psychology at University College London wrote an article called "Why Do People Join Cults?" And I think this quote just really sums it up. He says, this is Dr. Furham. He says, any analysis of the makeup of individual cultic groups shows a surprisingly large diversity in terms of age, career, education, ideology, and talents. They can attract the postgraduate and the illiterate, the teenager and the senior citizen, the solidly middle class, and those on the fringes of society. It is not so much their demography that is important, it is their psychological needs. So like I said, rich or poor, young or old, it's transitions, and it is emotional needs. We all experience these things: a loss of a job, financial stress, looking for friendship. That is when we are vulnerable to cults, simply because as humans, we have evolved to want to be part of a group. And that is healthy and that is good. And humans are meant to live in community. But when we are really starving for that, that is when it's easy for people to say nice things and try to pull us into a cult. And our guard is a little bit down because we're so desperate to have that need met. That is a legitimate need to have. We all need that community, but cults see that. They see it as a weakness and they prey on it. When in fact, our desire for community is a strength. We just need to find safe community because we are safer and better in numbers when the people around us are safe people. So, what can cults be disguised as? A cult can show up in any group, any community. And with the era of the internet, we're seeing a boom of cults, I believe. And where it used to be kind of defined where there was a centralized leader and there was maybe a location people would go to, with the internet, you can have ideologies that start creating cults and people who believe in the ideology, and there might be multiple people versus just one charismatic leader contributing to the ideology that people can access online. So we saw this in a huge way with QAnon. That is something that there's not necessarily one leader involved in that. There's many people pouring out this information, but people are being attracted to that information through the online space. So anywhere influence can be had, cults can pop up. And some of the examples of that would be in religious groups. We see them oftentimes in religious groups. And again, from the outside, you would have looked at my church and you're like, there's a steeple, there's the cross, there's the daycare, and all the things that are happening there. This is just a normal Baptist church, when in fact it was not. So it can hide in religious communities, and not just new fringy ones. Sometimes older communities and branches within denominations can become cultic. Workplaces can become cult-like communities depending on how they're run. Multi-level marketing groups, fitness groups, AA meetings even, campus clubs, and like I mentioned, even families. And families aren't bad. Campus clubs aren't necessarily bad. Going to work isn't necessarily bad. So it's not the environments per se, but it's what happens in some of those environments. Anything can become a cult, and the trick is not to avoid all groups and communities, but to know the red flags and the signs so you can protect yourself and realize it before you get in too deep. All right, so let's talk about 7 red flags of a cult leader. This is from Joe Navarro. He's an FBI counterintelligence agent who studied dangerous groups, and he came up with this list of 7 characteristics of cult leaders. The first one is they may believe themselves to be a deity or a chosen representative of a deity. I like to broaden this out a little bit more because I've seen people who maybe they don't use the term deity. Maybe they're like, oh, it's an alien who's telling me this information. Or, oh, I'm enlightened by this political information that I found someplace. Or, I heard this in a dream. So it doesn't always necessarily have to be a divine being, but there's usually something that they say they got their power from. And deity or chosen representative is usually how they identify. Number 2 is they are superficially charming and have a grandiose sense of self. So nobody gets into a cult because they want to get hurt. They get into a cult because they're like, wow, this seems like a great community. They're saying they want to do good things in the world. They're charming. They're interesting. They might be attractive. They might be all of these things. And cult leaders tend to really lean into being charismatic and interesting and something that you almost can't resist about their person or personality. Number 3 is anyone who criticizes or questions this cult's charismatic leader is called the enemy. So they will often come up with people who are the enemy. For us, we called it the world. Those people are of the world. And, that was kind of how we defined the enemy. Other groups will use other terms, but it'll be this idea of anyone who questions me is against me, and anyone who's against me is evil. Number 4 is they try to control others in what they do, read, view, or think. So it might start out small with just like, hey, I don't think that's a good thing for you to watch or read. Instead, read this pamphlet, or I've got my own blog online. And again, some of these character qualities you can see in people, and it doesn't mean it's a cult, but when you start stacking them on top of each other, you start to see, oh, wow, this is getting dangerous. Number 5 is they are hypersensitive to how they are seen or perceived by others. They have a fragile ego, and you almost have to walk on eggshells around them. Number 6 is they publicly devalue others as being inferior, incapable, or not worthy, and make members confess their sins or faults publicly. So they're always going to be the best, and everybody else is below them. There might be a few people that they have chosen to elevate, but behind the scenes, they're probably still knocking down those people as well. And then number 7 is even though they may be taking sexual advantage of others, they will often cover up sexual abuse. So a lot of times there's sexual, physical, emotional abuse happening in these groups. Again, not all this has to be present for it to be a cult, but when these things stack on top of each other, you start to realize a pattern. Now, how do people recruit members into their cult? Because again, nobody joins a cult because they're like, oh, wow, I want to ruin my life. I want to dump all my life savings into somebody else's pocket, and I want to have trauma. Like, literally, nobody's doing that. So why do people join cults? It's because of the recruitment tactics. Now, one thing I will say is for myself and for a lot of people, we were just born into it. So the recruitment looked quite different, and there were steps that were missed because that was just the reality I grew up, and I didn't know anything different. But for people on the outside that are being brought into the group, these are general steps that happen in recruitment. So one is the stages of indoctrination, and the first is the recruitment stage, and it's meant to entice victims to the controlling group. And there's a couple ways that this can be done. One is through promises of happiness, hope, change, a sense of belonging, higher levels of spiritual enlightenment, personal power, or rewards. So they're going to tell you about all the good things that you can get being involved in this group, and they're really going to hype it up so it sounds great and it sounds like just what you need. Other times, though, they might flip that. And these are probably a little bit less common, but these definitely happen. They might confront victims with threats of disaster or destruction. It's like, hey, if you don't follow this path, you're either going to be physically, spiritually, or politically, bankrupt. Things are going to go bad for you. This is like the apocalyptic groups. They may really use that to pull in. We were big on apocalyptic stuff as well. And then, they're going to try to control how they are presenting themselves to the outside world. So there might be just ruins happening on the inside, but on the outside, they're going to try to present themselves as being really a great group, and that they're the escape, the salvation, the only way to move forward into safety or into the things you desire. And like I said, sometimes this doesn't apply. Sometimes you're simply born into it. Step 2 in indoctrination into a cult is isolation. So claiming that others on the outside of the group are dangerous, people you need to watch out for, that is a big one. And they'll start isolating you through that. Other ways that they might do it is give the victim perceived important tasks for them to do, such as devoting big amounts of time to helping the group, saving the world, defending the group against attacks. And slowly but surely, the more you volunteer, the more you invest, the more you're given leadership roles and jobs inside of the cult, you start to realize, I don't have time for anything else in my life. And all of a sudden, you're slowly indoctrinated in. Step 3 is the will breaking stage. So the goal is to bring the victim into total submission to the controlling group in both thought, word, and also in action. So they might do this through subtle emotional manipulation, but they could also do it through substantial mental abuse, deeper isolation. Sometimes they'll use interrogation. If you start to step out of line a little bit, they might really go at you. They might do a lot of deprivation of things. It could be physical things, but it could also be like you've just given up your whole life. You made one wrong mistake, and now they're withholding some of their emotional connection to you as sort of a punishment. It could be physical or sexual abuse. Some cases, there can be torture, deprivation of food, forced labor, humiliation, and threats. And oftentimes, these start a little bit more gradually. A lot of times they'll start with like the emotional and mental abuse first, but it can get more and more physical and more toxic towards that way. Something that we had as a part of our community was called will breaking of a child. And I experienced that as a kid. And there's even evangelical child rearing manuals that talk about raising children and breaking their will. And so this can be done on adults, but it can also be done on kids. Number 4 is indoctrination. And this is when they're going to start reprogramming your mind and trying to remove the other memories, the other ideas, the other ways of existing in the world that you had and replacing them with their own thoughts, beliefs, and intentions from the controlling group. It'll start to feel like you're drinking out of a fire hydrant. It's like they're giving you so much information, you become totally overwhelmed and immersed in it that you can't even almost remember or have time to think about other perspectives. Sometimes they will do this by having you read or memorize a lot of dogma. There'll be a lot of lectures or sermons that you have to sit through. There'll be a lot of just like info dumping on this information from the cult, so much that you really don't have time to think or process anything else. It's just a constant stream of indoctrination. Number 5 is commitment/submission. And this is where they want you. They want you to be in total submission to the cult, and they will often test this by giving you different tasks to see if you're willing to suffer, if you're willing to go out on a limb, if you're willing to do the things that they're asking you to do, even at your own expense. And it might start small. It might just start with like, can you really make it to that friend's dinner? It seems like you should probably stay here and help us with our world changing efforts. Like, in the grand scheme of things, your friend's dinner is not that much. And so you're slowly giving up things, but then it can be really big things. Some people at the other end of the spectrum even give up their entire lives, but they want you to be focused so much on recruiting other people, paying attention to the rites and rituals that they have, learning about the ideology, and sacrificing your own wants and desires, because that is the place where you're most malleable and they can get you to do what they want. All right. Number 6 is shunning. This is if they can't get you into submission. If the will breaking didn't work, if the indoctrination didn't work, or it did work for a time and now you're starting to question things, then they'll start to use this shunning tactic. Now, shunning can show up in 2 main different ways. So it can be one of those things where it's threats of shunning, and you haven't actually left yet, but they're just like, hey, if you step out of this, there's going to be these big consequences, and nobody in the cult, who incidentally is your whole community now, is going to talk to you. Nobody's going to believe you. Everybody's going to shame you, and you're going to lose this entire support system. And for a lot of people, all their friends are there, all their family is there, their jobs might be tied to their emotional support is there, and so that can feel scary, and that's often enough to pull people in. The next phase is if somebody actually starts to step out and speak out about what's happening to them, then they'll actually enact all of those things, and they'll really let you feel the weight of this falling apart. And then simultaneously, depending on the group and depending on how outspoken you are, if they think there's a chance that at that stage they can pull you back in, they will sometimes use something called love bombing. And love bombing is when they go back to the first almost recruitment stage where they're like, remember the good days when you had connection with us and now you're missing out on all these group things and you're so sad and lonely, and why don't you come? We'll give you gifts. If they think there's any way they can pull you back in, sometimes they'll start using that love bombing tactic. But if they realize that you've passed the point of no return, they're going to go into hardcore shunning, and there's really nothing you can do about it. On the other hand, even for my personal story, the shunning can be nuanced. So there was an email that went out that said Ashley's removed herself from the family when I hadn't. But then there was a time when they tried to pull me back and have conversations, and I said, no, I see what's happening here. I'm not going to do that. And then I had to physically remove myself from the group. And so then they're able to take on, oh, she removed herself from us. And then it becomes my fault. And so it can be a nuanced thing, but the separation will be used as manipulation. And it's very difficult when your whole life has become built around this cultic community. All right. So now let's get into 3 tips for helping yourself or a friend break free from a cult. So now we kind of talked about what a cult is, and I hope that you'll stay on for our Q&A where we can go deeper if there's anything you want clarity on. But I think it's really important for us to go over, if you're listening to this and you're like, wow, a lot of those things seem like something that I'm in right now, or that totally is my sister or my friend or somebody that I know. Let's talk about how to help yourself or someone else break free. So number 1, it's important to be aware, to get knowledge and information. That is one of the biggest things that cults are going to try to keep you from, is the information about the truth. When I was exposed to the truth, it blew my mind. I didn't realize, I was feeling that things were off, but I didn't have words to describe them. So becoming aware that something is wrong, that is really the first step. Intuition is key here. My intuition showed up in a big way, and intuition might show up in, it usually speaks in 4 ways. So it could be something that you hear in your mind's ear. People aren't going to hear it outside of you, but just like, a word or phrase, like some questions that come up. It could be something that you kind of see in a dream or something like that. It could be a physical feeling in your body that something's not right, or all of a sudden a knowing that like, ooh, something's off here. When that happens, pay attention. That is trying to save your life, okay? The cult will continue to try to use fear, but information, intuition, all of those things are just going to be very calm, cool, clear, collected, of you just being like, wow, I feel like something's off here. Maybe I don't know why completely, but it's worth keeping on digging to see what the truth is. Always look for the truth. As soon as you become aware that something even might be off, pay attention. Number 2 is questions over conflict. So if you yourself are in a group like this, it's not going to be a great thing to start asking questions of the people in charge, because they're not going to take the questions very well. You can try that if you want to, but it's not going to go great. They're probably going to get defensive or give you thought-stopping answers. They're probably going to give you pat answers, but they're likely not going to give you the answers that you're seeking. You're really going to need to ask questions for yourself. And if you're trying to help somebody else leave, that's where questions are going to come in handy too. Because if you remember in my story, I didn't leave because somebody told me I was wrong. I left because somebody asked me questions and I was curious, and I was like, I don't know what the answers are to these, and I just need to figure this out. Questions were the things that changed my mind. It wasn't dogmatic statements. In fact, on my blog, the Stay at Home Daughter blog, I had a lot of dogmatic statements that would come in. There was a whole troll site that would come in and leave me comments about how I was wrong and make fun of me and all these things. And all of that just drove me deeper into the cult. I felt like I was a martyr doing something for God. But when somebody asked me questions and they didn't tell me what the answers were, that made a huge difference. So here's a list of a couple of things that you can do in a conversation with someone you think might be in a cult. One is ask thought provoking questions. Don't just make statements, ask questions. Two is adopt a general tone of curiosity and interest in their position. So don't you can ask questions in a way where you're like, I already know the answer, like gotcha questions. Those are not the kind of questions that we're talking about. It's questions where you're genuinely interested in what they think and you allow them to answer the questions. And then you ask another question. That's a big thing. Number three is remind them of past positive or authentic self experiences if possible. So, if they didn't grow up in a cult and they've experienced something outside of a cult, it can be really useful to remind them of the good times because the cult leaders can really get in your mind and you stop thinking about good experiences that you had in the past outside of the cult. And it's so important to be able to reconnect them with their authentic self, who they were before they experienced this mind control. Number four is share feelings and perceptions, not judgment. If they feel judged, they're going to feel attacked. And if they feel attacked, they're going to become defensive. And if they feel defensive, they're going to shut down and your opportunity has been closed off. Asking things like, or saying things like, I feel this way, or I'm not sure if I'm right about this, but I've always heard, and introducing other information is going to be a lot more effective than giving hardcore statements. Number five is ask a question and then wait for them to think and respond. Be patient and feel the need don't feel the need to like fill that space. What we often do when we ask people questions is we know what the answer is, so we want to fill it up. But it's really important in these scenarios to ask the question. And even if you kind of see their eyes moving around, like, oh my gosh, I never thought about that before, give pause and let them think because that might be the first time. There might be an aha moment happening and they might just be trying to process it. So ask questions and then wait for them to answer them. Don't give them the answers all the time because curiosity is the thing that can be really strong to make you want to find those answers. And when you go searching, you could find even more. And then number six is a caution. Facts don't necessarily help in these scenarios. Telling them what to do is only going to push them out. So, like, dumping a bunch of newspaper articles about why their group is a cult probably isn't going to be as helpful as asking them questions. Even if it is about a newspaper article, like, what do you think about this? Have you heard about this? I'd like to get your thoughts and perspective. That's going to be more effective than sending them like a document full of why their cult is trash. Like, that's just not going to go well. Another thing that is important to remember is you might not be the right person if you're too close to the situation. So the reason I was open to hearing those questions was because it was a man asking them. If it was a woman, I would have been like, oh, well, she's just self-interested as a woman trying to be a controlling woman. But since it was a man, I was like, oh, okay, well, maybe he's not, maybe he doesn't have any reason to be malicious about telling me that equality for women is okay. In other situations, if it's family, if you have been made out to be the black sheep of the family, it's often better to wait for people to reach out to you than for you to reach out to them or to find somebody else to reach out to them because you may be so close that they may have used kind of that shunning tactic and scared people close to you, telling them how dangerous you are. So it's often better to wait for those people to come to you and ask questions and be open and supportive if you're really close to the situation. That's a case-by-case basis, but just letting you know, sometimes it does really matter who the person is, and you don't really, you don't always know if you're the right person. So it's worth giving it a try if you have an option to do that, but just know that it's not all on you to be able to do this, which leads me to number three. Seek supportive services. Whether you're leaving for yourself or whether you're trying to help somebody else leave, You don't have to do this on your own. In fact, unless you are trained as somebody to help people exit cults, it's probably better if you don't do this on your own. It's probably better if you do have some support if you're leaving or if you're helping people leave. Now, if there's a crime or if there's a suspected crime, if children are involved, definitely report that to the police. But unfortunately, a lot of controlling and abusive behavior isn't a crime. But if it is, definitely get law enforcement involved. Ask yourself again, are you the right person for this job, or does somebody else need to be brought in who the other person would maybe see as more neutral? And then realize you can't save everyone. You can't save everyone. This is a thing that has been so painful for me as an advocate, whether it's helping people in domestic violence situations, sexual abuse, cults. You can't save everyone. And to a large extent, if they're adults, I'm not talking about children here, but if they're adults, if they don't want to leave, if they don't want to listen, if they don't want to get help, you're just going to have to wait until they're ready. And that's frustrating, but you can't beat yourself up about it. You cannot beat yourself up about it, because there were times in my life when I would never have been ready. But there was a critical time when I was. And so you just have to realize that maybe it's not the time. Maybe you're not the person. But if you can give it a shot, definitely give it a shot in helping someone. Now, I've had some questions about what to look for in safe community, and in the Q&A, we can go deeper into this if people have questions, but community is good. It's powerful. It's something that we all need as humans, and we've just talked about what toxic community looks like, and so beware of those red flags, but what are some of the green flags of a community? So one is an emphasis on consent and agency. You should be able to be yourself. You should be able to make your own choices, as long as they're not hurting anyone else. You should be able to be seen as an individual who can disagree, who can have different thoughts. And when that is promoted, that is really a green flag for a group. Again, as long as somebody's not hurting somebody else with their ideology or the way that they're showing up, letting other people be themselves, having agency is so important, is a key factor in safety. Another one is freedom of choice and expression. So not just being yourself, but also being able to choose for yourself, making your own decisions, expressing yourself in the way you want, wearing what you want to wear, behaving in the way you want to behave, having the personality you want to have, feeling the emotions you want to feel. All of those are green flags when those are welcomed in a group. Consequences are a big thing that we see in cults, but consequences come in two different categories. One is natural consequences and one is imposed consequences. Cults use imposed consequences, otherwise known as punishment. Punishments are things that happen that are not natural consequences, but are pushed on people to cause behavior change. Natural consequences are things that just happen because of a decision that you made, and it could be good, it could be bad. So leaving a cult, a natural consequence might be not having connection with people who are in that group to an extent because now you've moved to a different city. That could be a natural consequence. A punishable consequence is everybody being told in that group that they're not allowed to talk to you. A natural consequence of asking questions could be you don't like the answers that you get, but they're open and transparent with you. Or you do like the answers that you get and it brings you closer. A punishable consequence would be shaming you, putting you down for even asking the question. So it's really important that natural consequences are in existence, not punishable consequences. Next is questions are welcomed. Questions are so powerful. And I think that would even be my biggest tip for keeping yourself safe is one, listening to your intuition, and two, asking questions. Asking questions, getting information, that's huge. It should be a group where people are empowered to trust themselves, where the ultimate authority of your life is not the group or the group leader. The ultimate authority of your life is your intuition and what you decide to do for yourself. Safety is going to be paramount as well. People are going to be concerned about people being safe over doctrine being upheld. People are going to be concerned about people being safe versus doing things in a way that is easier and gets more people to join into the group. Okay? Safety is going to be huge. Transparency, accountability, those are green flags in a group. This doesn't mean a green flag group, a safe group is always going to be 100% perfect, but having the things on this list as the majority of the experience, those are the kind of groups you want to be a part of. We're never going to find a perfect group because people are there and people aren't perfect. But when these green flags exist, this shows that it is a lot safer of a community. Now, I want to go ahead and move into the Q&A portion. And you can go ahead and drop any questions below. I just want to leave you with one final thought. Be vigilant, ask questions, seek the truth, trust your intuition, and when you feel like something's off, it probably is, so pay close attention and dig in deeper until you find the truth. All right, so I am going to open it up for questions for a couple of minutes. I've seen a couple come through. Oh my gosh, so many likes and comments. I'm going to have to read through all these tonight. Let's see here. All right. Lots and lots of comments. I'm loving this. Okay. I was a little late. Will this be saved so I can watch it from the beginning later? Yes, absolutely. As soon as this live ends, then you can watch the replay. Just be aware that there was a little tech issue at the front end. And so you might have to fast forward through that. What else? All right, question. How old were you and what was the first moment you started to see outside questions and questioning the patriarchy and all of the prison of nesting dolls? I love that, prison of nesting dolls. So I started questioning when I was 21 and I physically left when I was 22 and I got married. Can you describe what went on in your mind? I just felt shocked that I had been lied to. I felt shocked that there was another world outside that was safer for women, that I could begin to see that these ideological things I'd been taught were really interlinked with the abuse I'd experienced. And so I felt overwhelmed, I felt shocked, and I felt like I was all alone for quite a while, actually, because the people in my community were not asking the same questions, at least not out loud. Let's see. Was it scary? Yeah, it was scary, for sure. There was lots of things that I was unsure about. The vitriol that we had used against people who'd stepped out of line, I always imagined that would be pointed toward outsiders, but when I became an outsider, I started receiving that, and that was something that I didn't expect. I mean, I should have expected it because, that's what we did to other people. But yeah, it was certainly scary, the uncertainty of what's going to happen in my life. I haven't prepared, and now I'm an adult and I've got to make decisions. Yeah. But once I got on the outside, yeah, things were a lot better. Curious, how old were you when you first started dating? So we actually practiced something called courtship in the cult, and that's when I had my first relationship, and I think I was 19, I want to say, when I had my first courtship. And then the traditional dating, I started that when I was 22 or 21. And actually, my husband and I dated for 4 months. We're engaged for 4 months. And on November 14th, we will have been married for 8 years. And let me tell you, best decision of my life. All right. When the trauma really surfaced, after you were with Will, what methods, modalities where did you seek help and guidance? So therapy was a huge thing for me. Researching was big because for myself, when I can understand something, I can realize that, okay, I'm not crazy. And now I can start to look at like modalities to help myself. But yeah, therapy was a really big thing. Talking about things, writing about things I'd experienced was super healing. Let's see, what else? Has anyone else been a part of a cult here? Okay, I guess that's just for people in the group. Yes. So many good comments. I can't wait to go back through and read. Okay, here's another one. Just curious if you saved your stay-at-home daughter blog anywhere to honor where you once were, or did you get rid of it as a symbolic cleansing? Moving on. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it's gone. It's long gone. I think I even was able to like scrub it from the web or something like that because I was like, oh, so embarrassed. And I apologize to anybody who read that blog if I led you astray. I was doing my best, but it was trash, and I really apologize. Getting over abuse is a series of many deaths, which makes room for a more authentic life. Ashley, did you or do you still do any release practices, rituals as you continue to shed those traumatic layers of your history? Yeah, 100%. So I love to do releasing rituals at the new moon or the full moon. I've done a lot of those. I really like to celebrate new versions of myself and recreate myself with different style and different energy. So I always do a vision board at the beginning of the year, and I try to imagine what the version of myself is I want to be for that year. And so that's kind of symbolic for me. Right now, I'm in my, I don't know, phase of like really liking the short blonde hair, and I've had blonde short hair for a while, but I'm kind of getting into like enjoying handbags and those kinds of things, and that just feels like an elevated version of Ashley that cult Ashley would have known nothing about. And so yeah, I go through different phases. What are red flags to look for in homeschool kids who may be in a cult? So the homeschooling movement, it started really in the US when, as a reaction to desegregating schools. So a lot of conservative Christians did not like that Black and brown children were able to be schooled with white children. And so there was this white panic that happened, and a lot of white people pulled their kids out of schools and either put them in private or Christian schools or started homeschooling. And so the homeschooling movement, though now there's a lot of secular things in it, those were really some of the foundations of being very politically and religiously isolating. And then with that, they started pulling in like all these different beliefs about patriarchy. So when you go to a statewide homeschooling convention, you're probably going to see a lot of material that is quiverful, unfortunately. I think it's probably less than it was 10 or 15 years ago, but there's still going to be a lot of that there. So as far as seeing it in kids, I would say some red flags that you could notice is, does the child seem like they can express themselves freely when they're in public? Or do they always seem extremely well behaved and almost wooden in a sense? Because a lot of times what will happen is the children will have to behave in a certain way where they're not really able to express themselves developmentally. I know I got comments from lots of people like, she's a little adult, and she's so well behaved and so well spoken. And well, thank you, that was my trauma response. So looking for things like that, definitely looking at how parents are behaving with their children, being curious about what some of the parents' beliefs are. Again, homeschooling isn't always bad. It can be very, very good. But if you're suspecting something like that, I would look at the behaviors of the children and do they match developmental points that a child that age normally would have. Did you take your several tries? Did it take you several tries to find a good therapist for you? So I've had several therapists, and I found one that I really like, and I think is the best therapist for me. But I had several in the past, and they were sort of for different phases of life. So yes, it took me a while to find what I really like now, but I certainly did have other therapists in the past. When you say version of yourself, do you mean external appearance changes only? No, no. When I up level myself, I try to adopt new ways of thinking, new mindsets. So I always am trying to look at what limiting beliefs do I have that I can release that are no longer serving me? What can I start believing now that will get me to the place that I ultimately want to be in my life in this season. And so external changes remind me of the internal belief shifts that I continue to make. And I really believe that we should always be growing, we should always be evolving, we shouldn't be stagnant. And so I try to celebrate each of those different versions of myself with a new way of dressing, a new way of looking, a new way of presenting myself. And so yeah, that's really kind of an inside and outside type of thing. Okay, so I had a couple of questions that people sent in during the week that I want to get to. And so if you have any other questions, feel free to drop them in the comments and I'll look at those in a second. But the questions that I have here are one, where do cult leaders get their ideas that they should start one? And do cult leaders themselves even realize that they have created one or that they are a cult? I think it depends on the cult leader. So abuse is always motivated by a lust for power and control. Always, always, whether it's physical, emotional, sexual, spiritual, any type of abuse. There may be other factors involved as well. Like the person might also have anger issues, but the reason they decided to use their anger issue in a way to physically harm you, that's because they wanted power and control. Same with sexual abuse, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse. Cults are the same way. They are always created by someone or someones who have a desire for power and control over other people. They may, in addition to that, think that they have an idealized version or a utopia version that they want to offer the world. And they may believe that having power and control over you and getting you to bow to their belief system will ultimately be better for you in the world. But at the end of the day, they feel like they have the right to say that to you. So most people that create cults would never call it a cult. That's a big thing. If cults never say, "Oh yes, we're a cult." If they did, nobody would join them. That's why they use the positive recruiting techniques of like, "Oh, hey, take this personality quiz or come join this group or whatever." We've got cool stuff going on. So I would say I don't think that they always set out to create a destructive group. I don't think it always is something where they're like, "Oh, I'm going to harm this many people." But I think that they're always motivated by power and control, and that they will do anything that they have in their power to do that. And that is where the abusive things start to come into place. And then there are others who, yes, absolutely, it's a monetary thing. I think of people like L. Ron Hubbard. The man used to be a writer of science fiction novels. I mean, he totally knew what he was doing when he started that. So it depends a little, but whatever the outside factors are, it's always about power and control. The other question is why, when are they finally going to be outlawed for cults? Unfortunately, a lot of cult behavior is not illegal. That's a sad thing about abuse in general. There's a lot of toxic, harmful, abusive things that are valid traumas for people, but we don't have laws against them, and they'd be really hard to create laws for. There are other things that definitely are illegal, and those are the things that you can catch cults on sometimes. A lot of times it's their exploitation of money because there's a paper trail there. Sometimes it's the physical or sexual abuse that you can catch, but a lot of the emotional abuse or giving incorrect material for people to read that has wild ideas, that's not illegal. And so they probably won't ever be outlawed unless there's an actual criminal thing happening. Now, just because something isn't criminal doesn't mean it's not destructive and that we shouldn't create awareness for it. But very few cultic groups will actually be shut down by the government because we do have freedom of speech, which is a good thing. But this is kind of one of those things that unfortunately you can only do so much. And so that's why it's really important to create awareness and to help people get out of them. And when there is something illegal happening, to really bring that up to law enforcement and FBI agencies that can do something about it. Those are the last questions that I'm seeing here. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to the talk.